We meet in uncertain times. Up and down the country and indeed across the world, people are being exposed to substandard sticky toffee puddings on a daily basis. This is something that simply cannot be allowed to continue, which is why me and my team have been working tirelessly to, yes, celebrate those places producing excellent STPs, but to also weed out the rogue traders who are giving STPs a bad name. Because bad STPs allow the likes of Big Apple Crumble and Big Tiramisu to swoop in to claim their spots on our pudding menus. There's far too much at stake to be complacent. Well, now, in a new development, the wider STP community is getting involved, and they've been writing in their droves with their own STP reviews, doing their own boots-on-the-ground journalism. So tonight, we'll be looking at their reviews and asking the very simple question based on the evidence that they've provided: is their score justified? Welcome to STP Review. Let's get stuck in. This first review comes in from David in Scotland, who says that this was his school leavers meal. It was his first STP for a while, extremely excited. On first impression, they'd made a great decision selecting vanilla ice cream, felt the scoop could have been a bit bigger. Says the STP was a decent size, plenty of sauce, thought the sauce was delicious, and there was plenty of it without it feeling like it was drowning the STP. He goes on to say that it was so tasty that I have to admit I licked the excess sauce off the plate at the end. We'll come back to that because I think that's an important detail that we need to recognize. It goes on to say, I enjoyed the STP, but wouldn't say it was the best I ever had. The inside was very good, nice and spongy, full of flavor. However, you would not be able to tell from the photo, but the texture became harder around the edges. This is the only slight issue that he had with the STP. He says his final decision was a 7 out of 10, which seems harsh, as it was a brilliant STP, but says there's a wee bit of room for improvement, which could easily take an STP of this standard to an 8 or a 9. He then goes on to say, P.S. I'm sorry, I don't have a before picture. I couldn't get an after picture as I was too busy eating my friend's STP. Again, we will come back to that. But first of all, look at that photo. I mean, is that enough sauce? Doesn't really look like it, does it? But apparently there was enough left behind that he was able to lick the excess sauce off the plate. Now, that's not something that I've done myself. I've not had the chance to partake in an STP sauce experience in that way, but who knows? Maybe I just haven't had good enough sauce to get me to that point where I would do something quite like that. But at a 7 out of 10, it feels like an overly harsh score. He says the only downside was that it was a bit small and that the texture was a bit hard around the edges. This feels like something that should be at an 8 at least, and to be fair to him, he does say that he thinks it's a bit harsh. David, you've eaten your STP, you've licked the sauce off the plate, you've eaten your friend's STP, but we're going for a 7 out of 10. Look, something doesn't feel like it's adding up. So based on the evidence provided, is the score justified? I think it's a bit harsh, David, but thank you for your service. Moving on, up next we have Sam, who had an STP at Heathrow Airport. And this is the STP, and all Sam says was, STP came with no sauce and therefore was impossible to eat. The ice cream served as a saving grace, but I was still unable to finish the STP. And he gives it a 2 out of 10. And there you can see that was the after. Look, sometimes we get STPs where we think there's not enough sauce. I mean, look, these people have never even heard of sauce by the looks of it. Look, I know we've had very strict rules for a really long time about liquids and how much you can take through security, but I didn't realize that that applied to the toffee sauce. Now, STPs in airports are not something that I've encountered very often, and it's not something we've discussed at great length, but I think it's extremely important. Look, you're either at the beginning or the end of a journey, and that should be a time of excitement, expectation, or deep reflection. Therefore, what we cannot have is a sauceless STP completely barreling its way and lodging itself firmly in your emotional state. This could be the bad omen that follows you throughout the holiday, or it could be the thing that turns what was a pretty okay holiday into something which you'd rather forget. We can't be having this. The only issue I have with this review from Sam, though, is that there isn't very much detail. How did it taste? Was it moist? Were there dates in it? All that detail is lacking. And if we're going to go low, we're going to need to back it up with some good detail. Was it a sauceless STP which actually tasted quite nice on its own? Again, very difficult to be able to judge. So to the all-important question, is the scoring justified? I'm having a hard time understanding whether it's a 2 out of 10, 3. It's definitely not going to be a high score. We know that for certain with the lack of source. But is it a 2, 3, 4? Very difficult to tell based on the evidence. But Sam, thank you for highlighting it, particularly on your journey. And thank you so much for your service. Well, next up, we have Shannon, who sent in an STP review from a pub in North Yorkshire in Boroughbridge. And she goes on to say that the STP was delightful. I was immediately impressed by the portion size. The STP was soft and moist with plenty of sauce. The ice cream was a nice accompaniment. I was only disappointed in myself for being unable to finish it. Very saucy, making it on the sweet side. And she goes for a 9.1 out of 10. Now, we all know the very important rule that you don't judge an STP by its cover, certainly not before you've had that first spoonful. However, looking at that photo, I would say that that's an STP that carries itself in the realm of a 9 out of 10. Look at the sauce. I mean, you can tell that that's a good quality sauce from looking at it. It's a good size and it looks moist. So I've not tried it, but if that came to me whilst I was at dinner, I would be optimistic about the outcome. So is Shannon's scoring justified? Almost. There isn't a huge amount of detail. She did say she didn't finish it, but that was her fault, she said, not because of the STP. And I do have a slight concern about the reference to the sauce, because I've had STPs which the pudding's tasted really good, but the sauce has been too overpowering, too sickly, and that's completely brought down the score. So the sweetness of the sauce is a hugely important component. It feels like we just sort of glossed over that. So would want to know a little bit more detail about that before thinking about whether or not it justifies a 9.1 out of 10. But I am struggling with this one. I am struggling. As I said, I'm looking at it, it feels like it's in the right place. So I think I'm going to say, in this case, yes, I think the scoring is just about justified on this one. Maybe the 0.1 and 9.1 might be pushing it a bit, but it definitely looks like it's something that would be in the 9 out of 10 category. Shannon, all the way from Boroughbridge, thank you for your service. And finally, Alistair, who's submitting this from his kitchen. Alistair says, I was attempting to find a recipe to cook and thought I would make an STP when I found a recipe for a savory STP. Let's take a deep breath. If anybody needs to take a moment, please do. I mean, you'll be taking several moments throughout this, I can assure you. He goes on to say, the recipe had few details on quantities for certain key ingredients and caused me great concern as its sparsity left room for the production of substandard STPs. The sponge was a less sweet version of the classic sponge, and extra dates added to improve the savory aspect of the dish. Savory, why are we talking about savory in the context of STPs? Anyway, Alistair goes on to say, this portion of the recipe, whilst different, still held the general spirit of an STP. While we may not still be at Heathrow Airport, but I'd like you to adopt the brace position just to prepare yourself for what's about to happen next. The sauce was an onion-based, slightly sweet, gravy-like mixture, which, while pleasant, strayed so far from the sauce dessert as to make the whole dish unrecognizable as an STP. I mean, why are we talking about onion in the context of an STP? That's the real question here. Anyway, Alistair has more. The dish in its entirety was a good experience, but one which reflects the dangerous misinformation about STPs being spread online. This could not class as an STP. Well, thank you. And the use of its name in such a manner could have negatively influenced those uninitiated into the joys of STPs. I do not disagree. He goes on to say, I did subsequently make a classic STP to check that it wasn't just my poor culinary skills, and this subsequent effort ranked as a 9. Would have been a 9.5, but the recipient requested the STP with custard, and I have a preference for ice cream, he says, and he has some photos attached to show his 9 out of 10, the 9.5 or the 9 out of 10 that he's scored for his STP by comparison. By comparison, he says, with the fraudulent savory version. So he gave the savory version, the fraudulent savory version, a 0 out of 10, and gave his a 9 out of 10, would have been a 9.5 if they'd got the custard ice cream situation correct. As we've been going through this, obviously, I've been showing you some of the photos. I haven't shown you the most heinous. So those of a nervous disposition, please look away now. I mean, just look at that. I sort of appreciate Alistair's commitment on this. If it's going to be savoury, you might as well go the whole hog, as it were, and put bacon with it. I mean, what is going on there? Bacon and mash with something which is apparently an STP. Call it a date loaf or something like that. But the name STP should be nowhere near this. This is a complete abomination. Now, Alistair, I'm glad you did a cleanse and made your own STP. You did give it a 9 and would have given it a 9.5 out of 10 because of the custard ice cream situation. Now, usually that for me isn't the thing that makes the distinction between whether something's a 9.5 or indeed any other score. Look, somebody maybe slightly less charitable may say that you'd had such a challenging experience with the so-called savory STP that on tasting your own normal STP, which no doubt was good, you have almost overcorrected because you were sort of trying to overcompensate for what was an extremely challenging and dramatic experience. Now, some people may say that. I'm not saying that. That would perhaps be uncharitable. However, from the evidence you provided, and because it's your own, I haven't yet seen the evidence to necessarily warrant a 9 or a 9.5 at this stage. So, Alistair, whilst you must be commended for the great work that you're doing to reveal and to uncover misinformation about STPs online, I do need a little bit more context and evidence to talk about your STP, your own STP, in the 9 out of 10 space. Is the scoring justified? Well, Alistair, on the savory, so-called savory STP, 0 out of 10, absolutely. In fact, I've been speaking to my team already about whether or not we can introduce some minus scoring as well for those that are actively harming the STP name, and we'll be reporting on that in due course, because I think this calls for some special extra measures to prevent people doing this sort of thing. But for your own, as I said, I need a little bit more evidence, but thank you so much for your service. So from plate licking to turbulence at Heathrow, to a justified 9 to a justified 9. That's, I'm afraid, all we have time for. You've been watching STP Review. Good night.